Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and today's guest is Esme Wang. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Keep the Channel Open is on hiatus through the end of the year, and I'm taking the opportunity to reshare some of my favorite past conversations. This week, I'm revisiting my 2016 conversation with my friend, writer Esme Wang. Esme Wang is a novelist and essayist. She is the author of the New York Times best-selling essay collection, The Collected Schizophrenias, for which she won the Grey Wolf Nonfiction Prize, and a debut novel, The Border of Paradise, which was called the Best Book of 2016 by NPR. She was named by Granta as one of the Best of Young American Novelists in 2017 and won the Whiting Award in 2018. Born in the Midwest to Taiwanese parents, she lives in San Francisco and can be found at esmewang.com and on Twitter at esmewang. So this conversation was recorded back in 2016, not too long after Esme's debut novel, The Border of Paradise, had come out. The book is a multi-generational family story about an interracial couple and their children and the way that trauma can be passed from one generation to another. It's a book that I just loved when I first read it, and one that I still think about a lot, especially the haunting final image. And that's what Esme and I talked about this novel. But since then, Esme has gone on to write a collection of essays called The Collected Schizophrenias, which combines elements of memoir and research to talk about mental illness in a way that I've never seen before, and which was both illuminating and incredibly moving. I've put purchase links for both books into the show notes, and I highly recommend getting yourself a copy of each. Also, one more thing before we start. In addition to being an amazing writer, Esme is also a wonderful teacher, and through the end of 2020, she's offering her Rawness of Remembering guided e-course for just $99. This is a self-paced online course about restorative journaling through difficult times, built by someone who's been in the trenches. You can get all the information about the course and register for it at esmewang.com/rawness. That's ESMEWANG.com/rawness. And use the coupon code GOODBYE2020 at checkout. Once again, that's esmewang.com/rawness, coupon code GOODBYE2020. And there's a link in the show notes for that. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Esme Wang. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. I'm really excited. I enjoyed the hell out of your book.
I am really excited to hear that you enjoyed the hell out of my book, and I'm really grateful that there are people who want to read it and do read it, so thank you.
I was trying to think about, I do this every time I end up talking to somebody for the show. I try to remember how I came to your work, and like a lot of times I cannot actually remember. In your case, I think that I found you on Twitter first and found your blog first, actually. And then it wasn't until afterwards that I found your book. And I always just sort of think that's sort of backwards, I think, how a lot of people find authors on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Reading your book was... how to put this? It was such an impressive piece of craft was the first thing that really struck me as I was reading it. And particularly what I found really interesting, just as a first cut, was like on a craft level, was how you have 5 different point of view characters and they all speak in the first person. And each one of them has just this very distinctly different voice.
Yeah, I think it ends up being actually like 7 points of view in total, including the omniscient last chapter. Mm-hmm. Oh, just to get this in here, the book is called The Border of Paradise.
Right.
Okay. But yeah, so that's a thing that happened.
Yeah, and I thought that was just a really interesting, really impressive as a writer to be able to make each character feel so distinct. The way that each one of them speaks, they don't feel like they're coming from the same person, even though obviously they are. Mm. And that just, as a person who tries to write from time to time, I'm always impressed by things like that. It's a lot more difficult, I think, than what a lot of people might realize.
It's interesting. I do get asked about the use of so many different points of view, and it definitely wasn't how I intended to write the book. The book actually started for the first maybe year and a half or so of the book's life. It was just William's point of view. So the only part that existed was the chapter that's now called The Arrangement, where William Nowak, who is this I think he might be the most what you might call voicey character, where his voice is just so bombastic and a little bit ridiculous. He has this very, very distinctive voice. And I think part of the reason I ended up going and writing these other points of view, that happened for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons was I realized William's voice could not carry an entire novel. I could not imagine anybody wanting to read an entire book of just William's voice. I like it a lot, but it's a lot to take in large doses. And that brings up another interesting thing that I think you and I talked briefly about on Twitter, which is people's very different and very strong reactions to the different characters. Mm-hmm. I'm really actually surprised by how I kind of thought that there might be one character that everybody liked more than all the other ones, or that people would have similar reactions to the different characters, but that's actually not the case at all. Just yesterday, actually, am I allowed to curse on this?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So yesterday I got this tweet that I thought was hilarious. It was like, I'm about 100 pages in and David is such a fuck boy. And I was like, oh my gosh, because there are people who really love David as a character. And I think I've actually had people tell me that their favorite character, I've had multiple people tell me that different people are their favorite characters. Mm-hmm. And I even read a Goodreads review, which I don't recommend to people. And I actually don't do this anymore, but I did read a Goodreads review where they were like, I hate everyone except for Sarah. And Sarah is the dog. So anyway, so that was, it was interesting for me because you were kind of live tweeting the book, not quite in detail, yeah. But you were saying that you were having these different reactions to, especially I think the male characters, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, what I found, so just to back up, I guess, for the listener, so this book is the story, it's a multi-generational story of a sort of interracial family starting back in the 40s, I think, or in the,
in the 40s.
And so you have David Nowak and then eventually his wife, who goes by Daisy in the United States, but that's not her actual name, which that in itself I think was really interesting to think about how names operate. Mm-hmm. Their children, William and Jillian, and then the later another character, Marianne, who is I don't want to give too much away, but she's a major character in David's past and in the children's lives. Mm-hmm. And this thing about, each character, I think to me, this idea that you find different people connecting with different characters or being turned off by different characters, it really speaks to the strength of the book itself. My reaction to each one of the characters, it was really interesting to notice. I wrote down a whole bunch of notes as I was reading and sort of live tweeting, which, just to pause for a second, the experience of live tweeting a book, that's something... It's very 2016, I feel like. It's not something I ever would have done in the past.
I loved it.
Yeah. But what I was noticing with each character is that, I went back and forth so many times with each character that there would be... And this was something that I thought was really interesting, how you built each character in a way where there's a deep sort of... I don't know if sympathy or empathy is quite the right word, either one. There's a little bit of both. But then each character has also something about them that is kind of off-putting, that sort of distances the reader. Mm-hmm. And the different, and each one of them that manifests differently. And that was just really fascinating as a reader to have such an arc with each character. You know?
Do you think human beings generally are this way, or do you think that was something specific, like a specific type of viewpoint in the book about the way people operate?
I think that, I mean, in reality, I think that we all contain multitudes, if I can be cliche for a second. But I don't think that you see that as often in literature. And so having it made each person in the book feel more like a real person.
That's good. That's something that I used to say about the book when people would ask me what it was about. And by the way, I'm very impressed by the way you summarized the book, because I still cannot, and it's July, the book came out in April. It's been months for me to be able to refine my elevator pitch, and I still can't do it. But
it's always easier with somebody else's work than your own.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah, so back when people used to ask me, what is your book about? I would say, it's about people who do things because they think the things that they're doing are the best for the people they love, and end up screwing up things very badly as a result. And I kind of still think that's what the book is about. And so many of the things that make different characters off-putting is the stuff that they do because they love someone or love multiple people, or think that what they're doing is something out of love. I don't know. It's still something that I think about.
I mean, to me, one of the things about it is this sort of tension and conflict between the story that each character is telling about themselves, is telling themselves about themselves, versus how their actions actually affect the other people around them. And this, because you get to see this from each different perspective, like you get to see how it actually plays out from other people's points of view. Like the chapter you mentioned with William, he has as you say, a sort of bombastic, it's a very, teenage boy, like, a loner teenage boy, grandiose language. And he views his relationship with his sister in a particular way. When you come to the next chapter and it's her point of view, she sees it obviously in a very different way, and you get to experience both sides of that.
Yeah, I just loved the way you described people's narratives about themselves and how that differs from the way they affect others, because it's the way that we all interact with one another, right? Like we all tell ourselves narratives about the way we are, or what our personalities are like, or what kind of person or people we are. And then that it plays out differently because life is complicated and the way we relate to other human beings is complicated.
Yeah, there's a line, I can't remember exactly which, it's in one of the David sections, where Marianne and he have just had an encounter, and she says, "You're not careful." And that, I actually wrote down the exact line, but I can't find my notes right now. But it was, that really struck me as just so emblematic of how the narrative for each character works, because everybody is sort of wrapped up in their own heads and has trouble seeing things from other people's points of view. It's like sort of the tragedy of actual life, Yeah,
like she says something like, "You're not careful, you don't think anything you do affects other people," or something like that. And I think that so easily happens in quote unquote real life outside of fiction. And I know this happens with me all the time, and I try to be aware of it, but it's very easy to, just to get stuck in your head, to get stuck in this narrative that's happening about your own life and the story that's being created by your everyday being. And other people are telling narratives in their heads about their everyday being as well. And then we all crash into each other, and and sometimes it's good. It's not all bad, but sometimes it can be very painful.
Yeah. Yeah. This book, I finished reading it several weeks ago at this point, and I'm still, I don't know, kind of haunted by it. There's something, it was another thing that was that we talked about a bit on Twitter, that that definitely bears on this story is because it is so much a story about trauma and how that plays out for each one of the characters. But I think a big part of how any particular reader is going to relate to the story is going to have to do with, each reader's relationship to trauma in their own life. And, the way that this story, again, I don't want to give anything away, but the arc of the story is it's neither wholly redemptive and neither wholly tragic. There's elements of each expressed, and that also makes it feel very real. Like, to have things tied up too prettily would be too easy, but to have things just be completely awful for everybody would also feel wrong for the story. The way that things play out in the story feels very true, in a way that these things have lasting effects for each one of the characters. They can't just be, tied up with a bow. And thinking about that, thinking as particularly the final image, really, it left me in a place where, haunted is really the only word I can think to use. I can't stop sort of thinking about these characters and, and where they're going and what's going to continue happening.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned the final image of the book, because I've also had some strong responses or reactions to that. It is an ambiguous ending, and it's interesting to see how different readers contend with that. Some people really choose to believe one thing about the ending, and some people choose to believe something else. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like literature is like one big Rorschach blot, and you just learn a lot about the reader by how they interpret what's there. But yeah, I got immediately after a friend of mine finished the book, she wrote me an email, and I think it was just like one sentence. It was like, "Oh my God, does blah 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 happen?" And that was it. And and I just had to write her back and say, like, well, it depends on what you think, really. Yeah. So, but another thing that you mentioned about trauma is, I think, something that I still think about a lot is how trauma isn't just about kind of the direct object of the trauma. Like, the trauma that each person experiences in the book resounds through the generations and affects other family members. It affects the people they love. There's kind of an idea too of intergenerational trauma, which is something that I studied in graduate school, actually. And in graduate school, I really got attached to this idea of immigration as trauma. I was very interested in the idea of how this thing that happens all the time, which is people immigrating to other countries, contains a lot of shock. There's language, and there's not quite belonging, and, there's racism or prejudice and all kinds of things. And most recently, my mother, who immigrated to the United States from Taiwan when she was in her early 20s, sent me a bunch of scans of pages from her old journal, and they're all pages from when she had just gotten to the US and I was a baby. And she's writing about being in a new country and trying to survive, and she also recounts the memory of saying goodbye to her parents at the airport, which I thought was so sad. But yeah, I remember receiving those scans and reading them and just crying, because I could not imagine being in her place. I couldn't imagine. I mean, I'm in my 30s now, and she had me when she was in her early 20s. I can't imagine being like 22 and having a baby and having just arrived in a new country. And it just seems like there's a lot to have to handle there. Yeah.
It's something I think, my family has been at least, some parts of my family have been in this country for like 5 generations. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's interesting, this thing that you're talking about with your own family also shows up in the book, this sort of trauma that gets passed down. I think, even though it can be muted after enough generations, I think there's like having an immigrant family mm-hmm. really informs a lot about your family, the story that your family tells about itself, and how you and your family relate to the place where you live. Mm-hmm. And that's definitely in the book. I think it's interesting to consider how that feeling of foreignness can continue on down in the generations, despite, people like you and me being born here mm-hmm. still always can retain that feeling of foreignness. Mm-hmm. And in your book, that's like actually really literalized in how William and Jillian are raised, mm-hmm. Completely separate from the rest of society. Mm-hmm. But I found it really interesting to consider how each one of the characters, whatever their background might be, whether it's David or Daisy or William or Jillian or Marianne, each one of them has this feeling of isolation, of being the other, mm-hmm. along multiple axes, whether it's race or gender or sexuality. Marianne's brother, whether, in particularly mental illness plays a large role with a lot of the characters. Mm-hmm. And seeing the intersection of all of those things was just breathtaking.
Oh, thanks. It's interesting to listen to you talk about this, because then I started wondering, does anybody just exist where they are and think, man, I so belong here. I am completely where I'm supposed to be, and everybody else is different. Mm-hmm. I'm the one who's right or correct. Mm-hmm. Like my existence is correct.
Yeah. What do you think?
I have no idea. It also reminds me of this. This is going to seem really off topic, but yesterday I went to a book event for I'm going to pronounce her last name wrong, but it's Heather Havrelisky, who does the Ask Polly column. And I actually read her new book recently, and there was one advice column based around this young woman's letter about being in her early 20s. And the letter was basically saying, I'm so weird, and I'm afraid that I'm never going to belong anywhere because I'm so weird. And she kept trying to use these different examples to prove her weirdness, like having Hello Kitty stuff in her bedroom, or sleeping with a teddy bear, or telling weird jokes in public. And she kept talking about how she was never going to belong. And in the response, the Ask Polly column ended up saying basically like, you're not that weird. Like everybody's weird, mm-hmm. which I really liked. But at the same time, I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of believing everybody else is normal and everybody else belongs. And mm-hmm. I just am never going to be that person.
Yeah. I think too, like one of the things I wonder, I think everybody does feel alienated to some degree, and everybody, like nobody belongs as much as they wish they did. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably true. At the same time, like I think about this a lot, how it seems to me that even if that's true, though, that there are some mechanisms of alienation that would be more acute than others. And, things like race or sexuality or mental illness, it's not necessarily the same as somebody just feeling like a weirdo culture, like because
yes,
they like science fiction or something,
Yes, I totally agree. Like I'm not trying to say that, like, oh, nope, nobody is normal. I actually hate it when people say that. Mm-hmm. But I think okay, so yes, I completely agree with you. I think what I was saying maybe ineffectively was that no matter how much you belong in terms of your position of privilege sociologically and socially and culturally, it is amazing to me how much people manage to feel like they don't belong.
Yeah. And I certainly don't mean to minimize that at all. I think that came across just fine in how you put it. You know, and I do think that that's something that it's worthwhile to keep in mind, because, you know, like I always say, you know, everybody's problems are actual problems for them, you know? And that is something it doesn't mean everybody's problems are severe to the same degree, but I think it's certainly, just on a personal level, worth remembering that we all are struggling in some way, to have empathy in that way. It can be hard to do sometimes.
Yeah, I agree. I have like a little anecdote. I'm not entirely sure that it fits in this conversation, but so my husband, whose name is Chris, and I, a couple of years ago, so we went to Whole Foods, and we don't usually shop at Whole Foods. And the reason that we were going that day was that I had just come back from this doctor's appointment, and he'd come with me. And I was very sick at the time, and I was just first becoming ill with this very mysterious disease. I was not functioning well. I had to leave my job. They thought I might have cancer. We were doing like MRIs and EGs and like CAT scans and CT scans, all kinds of stuff, because I was very sick and we didn't know what was wrong. Anyway, so one thing that my doctor had suggested, because they were still trying to figure out what was wrong with me, was to take these certain supplements that you could apparently only get at Whole Foods. So I had just come from this doctor's appointment. I had just gotten something like 15 tubes of blood taken for various blood tests. And it was just this very upsetting time in our lives. And so Chris and I were at the Whole Foods, and we had gotten the supplements. We had our basket with the supplements in it. We're heading towards the checkout line. And I noticed that Chris bumped into somebody, and the person he bumped into looked at him with this incredibly scathing look, just like, oh my gosh, you asshole, like how could you bump into me and not acknowledge me? And it was interesting because Chris is a really considerate person. Like, he is the person who has to remind me to not go barging into an elevator as soon as it opens, because you have to let the other people out first. But he was very distracted at the time because he was worried. And I remember, and he did not notice this person glaring at him, and he hadn't realized he had bumped into somebody. But I just remember looking at that person and thinking, like, I'm so sorry. Like, this is not his normal behavior. He didn't notice that he bumped into you. We're going through something really stressful right now. And then as we were in the checkout line, I started thinking to myself, I also don't know what's going on in that person's life. Maybe they're going through something really stressful right now. Maybe like they can't afford anything at Whole Foods, and they just come here every day to browse and pretend like they're wealthy enough to be able to afford like a $15 chocolate bar. But yeah, so that's like a small anecdote about an experience that really stuck with me.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things maybe that if it can tie back into the rest of the conversation, but I think that impulse to look more closely and to wonder about what is actually happening. I mean, maybe that is like a very writerly type of thing to do, that the impulse to empathize and to see more than just the surface. You know, when you can do that in your writing, that makes for a very compelling narrative.
Yeah, I think that might be what ends up creating characters in which you can say, like, man, that person is a real asshole, but also to know that there's a lot going on there besides just the behavior that you're seeing or reading about.
Yeah. So I don't know if this is something that how much you feel comfortable talking about, but you mentioned that that you had been dealing with an illness. That's something I know. I mean, you do speak about it on your blog and on Twitter a fair amount, and it's one of the things that I think, how to put this. You write a lot about different ways to either manage or cope with or work through or don't work through but be okay with limitations that your life circumstances have put on you. And I think a lot of people who read the nonfiction that you write find a lot of inspiration in that.
Yeah, that's something that definitely only happened after I started getting sick. So I was diagnosed finally in early 2015 with chronic Lyme disease or late stage Lyme disease. It goes under a couple of different names, and it's a controversial diagnosis, and the CDC doesn't recognize it as it is. But anyway, besides all that, what it means for me in my day-to-day life is that I'm sick to some degree every single day. And that changed a lot of things about the way I needed to operate in life, not just my day-to-day behavior and such, but also the way I thought about things and my attitude. It's challenging to become very sick for anybody, but I think for me, the biggest challenge was being a really ambitious person who had and still has really big dreams, who has always competed. I feel like that's a weird word to use, but competed at a high level, and then to lose a lot of different levels of ability. So ranging from like not being able to lift my arms or like walk to not being able to have the cognitive ability to write like a sentence or a paragraph or to come up with the words to say what I want to say. And so I still struggle with this, the kind of tension between having a lot of ambition and having a lot of limitations. But you're right in that over the last couple of years, I kind of struggle with that in public. I want people who are in a similar situation, and I think there are a lot of people like this, people who are in a similar situation, to be able to see somebody else talk about it. I'm actually teaching a workshop at the Get Bullish conference in Palm Springs in September. I'm teaching a workshop called Ass Kicking with Limitations 101, which is kind of the culmination of all of this kind of thinking. There was a blog post that I wrote that is perennially popular. I think any time it gets discovered and then retweeted and shared a lot, it finds a new audience, and I'm glad. But it's basically, I think the post is called "You Are Not Lazy," and that's basically what the post is about. But I think that's a real concern that people have when they live with any kind of limitations, whether it's illness or something else, caring for elderly and sick parents, or anything that causes a person to feel limited in what they're able to do or want to do. A lot of times I think that limitations cause people to feel lazy and to worry that they're lazy. I also wrote a piece for Elle.com about this. I can't remember what they ended up calling the article, but that was pretty popular too among especially people with chronic illness. I wrote about being worried that I was actually secretly lazy because a lot of the time I'm not able to do things.
I mean, I think that, self-acceptance can be difficult, I think, for everybody at times. And having real things in your life that to struggle against makes that more acute. Mm-hmm. I'm not the first person to note this. Different people have different opinions on this, but I think right now, maybe for the past 3-4 years, that we're in sort of a personal essay, confessional renaissance, perhaps. Mm. And there are some old people who grumble about that kind of thing. But for me, I find it incredibly valuable, and I know a lot of other people do too, that seeing people willing to be vulnerable in public and people talking about, the real struggles that they have on any topic, on any level. I think that it not only, humanizes people that we might want to view as celebrities or as, sort of mysterious artists, but also it really provides an opportunity for connection and an opportunity as a reader or an audience member to feel, to feel less alone and less isolated. And
I agree completely.
I mean, I personally, I think the reason that I wanted to read your book so much is that reading your essays and your journal on your website, all of these things, I think there was a lot in there, even though the circumstances of my life and my struggles are not the same as yours, that there are aspects that I could relate to and that felt very familiar. And I felt like, a person who can write an essay with this much empathy and can make me feel, emotions so strongly this way. I mean, I can only imagine that I would want to, that her fiction would do just as much or more for me. And that turned out to be true.
Oh, that makes me really happy. Thank you.
So I have a whole long list of notes about the Border of Paradise that I don't know if we're going to have time to get to all of them. There's so much to talk about with this. Before we switch into the second segment, is there anything that you'd like to touch on about the book that we haven't talked about already?
I would be interested to hear your thoughts about the interracial relationship between David and Daisy as it's depicted in the book, and maybe to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. A huge source of my, the racial, not politics exactly, but how race affects particularly the way David approaches different characters, his wife, his lover, his children, that it was a real point for me. It was something that really triggered is a little too strong maybe, but it really touched something off in me. Seeing that. And I know, at different times I would write down in my notebook, different things that David would say. And then next to write something like, man, fuck that guy. And, but I mean, it was just so interesting because there were these points at which he is being super sexist or super racist towards people that he's close to, that he, I think legitimately loves, and that would infuriate me because I have seen that play out so many times in real life. But then I would also feel like he has a certain self-awareness that also sort of pulls me back in. And, particularly his relationship with his two children, this sort of separateness that he feels from his half Asian son. There's a thing in that particularly where he talks about how he feels very different from his son. And I think there's a line, I wrote this down, where he says it's the father who's permitted to lack absolute absorption in his offspring. And when I read that, I just felt this rage because it was here's a thing that just love your kids, goddammit. But I think it also touched on things that were profoundly true. I think And here's another thing that I'm always impressed by. Writers who can sort of write outside their experience is not something that I've ever been able to do. I mean, obviously we all have parents, and so we all have an experience with that relationship. But I think it's really impressive where I think there are aspects of being a parent that are hard to, if not impossible, to get at if you haven't lived it yourself. And I know you don't have kids, but there are aspects to that relationship that you wrote from the parental side that just felt like devastatingly true.
Oh, I mean, I saw you tweet about that, and it was one of the, this might be a weird way of putting it, but it was like one of the nicest things anybody had said about my book. I was actually very surprised when I saw you say that, because I, as a writer who doesn't have children, I had no idea when I was writing it how it was going to come off, whether I would be able to pull it off, whether it would feel at all realistic or genuine or strike at any kind of emotional resonance. So I was glad to hear that.
Yeah. I mean, this thing, I think one thing that is a lot of people don't really realize is that, the standard narrative of having children is that it's love at first sight. But, this is something I've talked about before, that for me, it wasn't love at first sight. That, like, as my children grow, I grow closer and closer to them. But for me, I can't love someone without knowing them. Mm-hmm. And I don't know someone when I first meet them. Mm-hmm. The love that I feel for my children now is so strong that it sometimes literally takes my breath away, where like it feels like there's a weight on my chest and I can't draw a breath. Mm-hmm. But I didn't feel that on the first day with any of them. I have 3 kids now. And so there was this aspect to David lacking a connection with his kids that felt familiar, but also, and in a way, my anger towards the way he talked about it was maybe an anger towards myself. Even though I think I've forgiven myself for that at this point. But I think also, another thing too is that, so I'm multiracial. I'm 3/4 Japanese. I have one Caucasian grandparent. My wife is Caucasian. And so my kids are less than half Japanese. And that is something that I have thought about. Like, it's something that, like, their experience of life is going to be something so not completely different, and it's going to be different for a lot of reasons other than just that. But that is one thing that separates me from them. Mm-hmm. And so, like, I think I reacted to that truth in a different way than David reacts to it. And I hope in a healthier way. But, like, it's one of those things that, like, I don't think I would have gotten so upset about seeing that in the book if it weren't touching on something true.
Yeah. And with David, I think he gets rather defensive and afraid about particular things. Like, the first thing that comes to mind for me is when he gets in an argument with Daisy about speaking Mandarin to William. And she says something like, well, I can't remember how exactly this conversation goes, but I think she says something like, he's Chinese or something. And then David really balks at that. But I think when I was writing those scenes and that relationship, I was trying to really dig into David's anxiety about not feeling connected to William. Mm-hmm. His anxiety about William not really looking like him in a lot of ways physically. And then to have this relationship with his son where his son might be fluent or think and speak something that he has no access to. I mean, he could learn Mandarin, but I don't think he would have tried. Mm-hmm. That wasn't really in his wheelhouse. But I think there was a lot of fear of alienation from his own kid. And I was also interested in what you were saying about your relationship with your children, because this is something that I don't know if you follow Nicole Cliff on Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember when she was tweeting about this? So she went on a very long Twitter. It wasn't a rant. It was just like a long thread about how both she and her husband did not feel immediate, overwhelming love for their children as soon as they were born, and how neither of them wanted to admit it to one another because they were afraid something was wrong with them or something was wrong with their relationship to their children. And I remember Nicole saying, oh, by the way, like Nicole Cliff is a co-founder of The Toast,
right,
which is a website that doesn't exist anymore,
man.
but which is really sad. But so that's who Nicole is. But she was saying, I remember, I want to tell people about this because it's something that people don't really talk about and can often be very afraid of and ashamed of.
Yeah, and I remember she got a lot of positive response to that, but like, I think that fear that people have about talking about this, how there's really only one acceptable narrative to parenthood, it really did play out in that thread where she had people who were saying really nasty things about her or her husband. And so, like, I mean, having that fear of discussing these things, I mean, it's a real thing. It's for a real reason.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to have the people telling you, like, you're a monster. How could you not immediately love your child? But I was really grateful, even though I don't plan on having children, I was really grateful to see her talk about it.
Yeah. It's one of those things that's for me, it's a central aspect of my life. My parenthood is a big part of my life and my identity, how I think about myself. And like anything, it can be kind of fraught. It can be kind of, it's something that both brings people together and makes you feel very alone sometimes.
Yeah, like I was really interested in, I caught some of your conversation with some people about you having, I think, father in your Twitter profile.
Yeah.
And how that can have different meanings for different people.
Yeah. It's a thing, like I have the first two, like I have a long comma separated laundry list in my Twitter profile, and the first two are dad and husband. And it's just one of those Twitter memes that it's like having an egg avatar that, like, or an anime avatar that, like, people who put dad, husband as their first two things in their bio are almost universally awful and really sexist.
I did not know this. I've never noticed this. So you're really opening my eyes here.
Yeah, I first noticed it when somebody pointed out that Barack Obama has that as his thing, and somebody was making a joke about that. But I was like, oh.
Why do you think that so many people who are terrible on Twitter have that as the first two things on their profile?
I think it really speaks to patriarchy. I think it really is about, how people think about masculinity, how people think about being a husband or being a dad, and what that means, what those roles are supposed to be. And I think for a lot of people that those roles, they're about authority in really toxic ways. And so even though you might think of yourself as someone who's a parent, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to all people, and particularly all men, that, a lot of these guys, you might think of themselves as good dads, and maybe they are in a lot of ways, but they can still be very patronizing. And that's, to me, it's deeply upsetting because, I want fatherhood to mean a particular thing, or it to be more inclusive. I want dads to be able to be seen as nurturing and not just, the guy who grills and fixes stuff.
Yeah, the bumbling husband / father narrative established by things like that Tim Allen show, Improvement, things like that.
It's a real thing. Going back to that thing that you were talking about with David and with language, that was, I thought, really interesting. And I know you've spoken about this, written about this other places, that your use of untranslated Chinese, but not just untranslated, but also unromanized Chinese, and the way that you use language in this book is fascinating. I mean, I know that is something you've written about elsewhere. I'll put a link in the show notes to the LitHub piece that you wrote. But I did think that was a really effective way of establishing a sort of feel to the way that these people communicate.
Thank you. It was an interesting way to play around with different layers of understanding, but not only understanding, also belonging.
Mm-hmm.
So there are these different layers of Chinese and English in the book. So there's non-Romanized Chinese characters, which are very difficult to try and translate. You can't plug it into Google Translate unless you already have the characters, or unless you have a keyboard that can do Chinese characters. So that can be very opaque to someone who can't read Chinese. Then there's Pinyin, which is the Romanized version of Mandarin. And with Pinyin, you can sound out the words, which is a certain level of understanding that is closer to true understanding than the more opaque characters. Then there's ways that Daisy interprets English. So there's certain lines of dialogue in the book when she's communicating with someone who's a native English speaker, where there are these blank spaces when she doesn't understand a word. And those I tried to construct as actual sentences. So the blanks that are there are actual words. They're just not in the text. But yeah, so I was trying to convey different kinds of understanding. And so for myself, I had to come up with different rules for when I would use characters versus using Pinyin. So one would be if a Chinese character was speaking to another Chinese character, there would be more of the actual double meaning of character, actual Chinese characters, or the pictograms. There would be more of that because there would be this kind of understanding between the two. But there is also a scene where David lifts like a glass of whiskey, and he says "Ganbei," and that's like a toast in Mandarin, but it's written in Pinyin because David doesn't understand Chinese in that more complex way. So yeah, it was an adventure, and I'm glad I tried it. I do wonder if I could have been more effective with it, or if I could have done more complicated things with it. But I'm glad that I got to try that. It's something that I have not seen in other books. I think there are other books that do similar things. I was in part inspired by Junot Diaz's work. And in the piece that you were referring to that I wrote for LitHub, in which I explain why I use untranslated Chinese, it opens with an anecdote about a friend of mine who was really angry when the Oscar Wilde book came out, because there's so much untranslated Spanish in it, and she was so angry that it excluded her from understanding the text.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, especially because Oscar Wilde as a book, like that book it's exclusive in multiple ways.
Yes,
it's
Junot Diaz says that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you don't understand all of the like D&D and Tolkien and like, if you didn't grow up a total like fantasy nerd the way that he apparently did, like that stuff is going to be at least as exclusive as all the Spanish.
Yeah.
But so I mean, it's funny that would be the thing that people would hang on to, although I guess it makes sense as well, just considering the kind of culture that we live in. I found that book to be it's so interesting because like the references that I got, like when he was making deep cut references to stuff that I knew from my own childhood, it was like one of these things that was like, oh my God, this book is about me. But then, the other parts where it would be, I didn't understand stuff. Even, some of the cuts were a little too deep even for me. And then I would be like, oh, I feel a little left out here. But I thought like, if you can be self-aware enough to examine that reaction, I mean, I think that's kind of the point of it, like the way that it includes or excludes and how that works is I think that's kind of brilliant. And the same thing with your book. It's not like I can't read Chinese characters, and I only know a little bit of Mandarin at all, and only that because I took a class in it for my job. But it's not really that hard to get the gist of what your characters are saying. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can kind of get the main feel of it, and the way that serves to, like, it really creates a feeling of, because the ability or inability to connect and to communicate is such a powerful theme in the book that it, by putting you, the reader, in that position in the same way that the characters are in, I mean, that is performing a function that I don't know if you could do in a different way.
Yeah. No, I really wanted to be able to achieve that kind of level of being in someone's shoes, a particular character's shoes, to be able to say, I don't understand what this, if you are someone who grew up speaking English, I don't understand what this character who is speaking English in this scene is saying, mm-hmm. because there are words that aren't there. Mm-hmm. And to be able to say, okay, well, that's the experience of the character in this scene, mm-hmm. who isn't able to understand those words.
So for the second segment, I always ask my guests to bring a topic of their own, just whatever is on your mind. So I'm just, what would you like to talk about?
I would like to talk about being on Twitter.
Okay.
I think there's so many interesting things about Twitter and the way that it's developed. And I mean, there are things that are foremost in my mind today, in particular, because of what happened with Leslie Jones yesterday. Oh, yeah. So Twitter harassment is kind of foremost on my mind today. But there are things that interest me about Twitter that I feel like don't happen on other social media platforms. These kind of conversations that happen, the way that you can eavesdrop on other conversations if you follow both of the people in the conversation. Yes. Like sometimes I will imagine what Twitter would be like if it were in the physical world, and it's just fascinating to me. I remember the day I realized just how strange it was for me to be able to eavesdrop on other people's conversations as long as I followed both of them. And I tried to imagine this big room of people all having different conversations and just being like magnetized to two people in a corner talking about like their Tinder date from mm-hmm. the previous night, just because like I happen to know both of them. But yeah, I'm willing to talk about anything Twitter related. I think it's a fascinating platform and has developed to have so many different facets.
Yeah. I always think it's interesting. Like, gosh, you said so many things that like I think are fascinating. Like that thing about eavesdropping, that's like basically my favorite thing is to see like two writers that I admire talking to each other and just goofing around is like, that's probably my favorite thing, maybe in life, like I adore that. I think that may actually be kind of how I ended up finding you, is because of a conversation that you were having with maybe Celeste Ng, and maybe Nicole Chung. I don't know, like, but seeing people talking to each other, I mean, it's great. But this thing that you said about how, if it were in real life, that would be very weird and rude. Like that's a thing. The etiquette of that kind of eavesdropping is, it's not quite the same as if it were in real life. But there are, I don't know, like this thing about sliding into somebody else's mentions is like, I've never quite been able to figure out the etiquette of it,
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because, okay, so say you did not know either, Celeste or me particularly well, but you happen to be able to witness our entire conversation. Like, there are people who will jump into that conversation because they're watching it and they have something they want to say, and then all of a sudden you're like, who is this person who wants to like contribute to the conversation? I mean, it's interesting. I guess that is what you mean by sliding into someone's mentions. But yeah, I mean, that's something that might happen in real life, if, you know, two people are talking and then somebody just kind of sidles up and starts inserting themselves into the conversation. But yeah, I think that is a thing that Twitter enables in a particular way. That's interesting. And I actually wonder too how the different ways that the technology works impacts the way conversations happen. Like, I'm actually not sure when this is going to happen or if it's already happening, but do you remember when Twitter released a whole bunch of changes they were going to make? And one of them was when you start something, like when you start a tweet directed at someone, you no longer have to put the period in front of that person's handle in order to make it publicly seen by everybody. Like, I went and how incredibly upset people were about that. Yeah. Because it does, if it's already happening, it does or will shift the way conversations happen and how quote unquote public or private things are.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think, to me, I thought like a lot of the backlash at that point, part of it is that I think a bigger part might have just been that people were upset that they weren't working on things that actually people cared about, like harassment.
Yeah. Oh, completely. Yeah.
But like, and I think that the changes they're making to those kinds of things, some of them are, I think that like that period notation is going to continue to be used just for people, because they're like, sometimes if you at somebody, it will go, but sometimes it won't. And if you want like the whole conversation to be seen, then it won't necessarily be seen once you start replying. And I don't know, it's weird. And like the whole thing too, like when you talk about like at replying people, there's another thing too that like kind of weirds me out, is that how sometimes, I don't know, like there's just no agreed upon convention where like I've like had people like be like, stop, you know, take me out of this. I'm not part of this, you know, stop replying to everybody. But then also like I'll do that sometimes and I'll take everybody out except for the person I'm talking to. And they'll be like, hey, why are you like only talking to me? This is a big conversation and we should all be having it. Why don't you just like be part of the actual discussion? And I'm like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there are different layers of Twitter etiquette. I remember seeing, I think it was Feminista Jones who made this long kind of tweet storm rather recently about Twitter etiquette. And her point was to say that as a semi-public figure, she ends up receiving more trolling and more abuse if people don't use certain kinds of Twitter etiquette with her handle. So I think maybe an example she used was, if you're talking about DeRay, it's not necessary to use his handle when you're just talking about him, because then you end up attracting people to his handle and potentially his mentions. And if somebody finds your tweet upsetting, they might reply to you and then he gets dragged into it. Or, you know, the same thing could happen with her if you decide to say, well, I have a lot of thoughts about racism, and someone who also has these thoughts is Feminista Jones, and then you use her handle. Then if like 500 people reply to you with their angry thoughts, then she will get those as well.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, you know, especially because for me, a lot of the people that I follow are, you know, they're artists or journalists or you know, and being able to have that kind of access to people, it's something that has never happened before, I feel like. And it's really changed the conversation, the etiquette of, you know, knowing when to include those people. Like there will be times when you want to include people in the conversation, and sometimes that's okay and sometimes it's not. And it's hard to sort of feel that out sometimes, but I don't know. I do think that a lot of people don't even bother thinking about it. So that's, you know, that thing that you, what was it that you said just a minute ago about the kinds of conversations that Twitter enables? I think it's fascinating that one of the things that has been happening to me a lot is that I'll start talking to somebody and I'll have like, you know, 5 or 6 ats in a row, you know, because of the character limit. And then people will be like, we can't have this conversation on Twitter because 140 characters just won't do it. And I think what's fascinating to me is that I feel like I end up having more impactful and meaningful conversations on Twitter than I do on any other platform. Much more than on Facebook, on Instagram, on, LO.
Yeah, I didn't know it still existed, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, it may. I think I still get emails from time to time from them saying, please use it. Like, they're really trying to make fetch happen.
Oh, man.
But, you look at something like Facebook, there is no character limit on posts or replies. And yet I very rarely have substantive conversations there. And a lot of times when I see people posting substantively on Facebook, it kind of seems like, man, why? It's not your blog. Just cut it out.
Well, I think, those other platforms that you mentioned are not built for conversation. I mean, there's a reason that people refer to Twitter as like the water cooler social media type, because at least from my perspective, because you are so limited with the amount of characters you can use, it is a bit more like having an actual face-to-face conversation. It's very rare that, it's very frequent that you will be on Facebook and see somebody write this big, long rant about like Trump or something. It's like 5 paragraphs of their Trump rage. But it's much harder to do something like that on Twitter. You're much more likely to have people interacting with you before you can get out your 5-paragraph rant.
I think it's so fascinating that both the conversations and the relationships on Twitter feel so much more real than on other platforms. Certainly, I've had conversations with you that have meant a lot to me, and like I don't know how that would ever have happened at any other time when I could write to an artist or a writer or that I admired and actually have a real conversation with them. That it's pretty, I don't know, it's something.
It definitely is. And I worry that Twitter is not going to, I mean, I know Twitter is not going to last forever, but I do think about, okay, what would I do if I didn't have access to Twitter anymore because it didn't exist anymore? Part of the reason I became so involved in Twitter and became kind of like a heavy user of Twitter was due to becoming ill. I became a Twitter user. I can't even remember. It was fairly early though. Like I've been an early adopter of a number of tech things, and Twitter was one of them, but I didn't start really using it heavily until I was sick. And that happened because Twitter somehow fits right in that space between, what am I trying to say? So like when I'm lying in bed and I don't have the cognitive ability to like read a book or have a conversation with someone face to face, let alone sit up to have a conversation with someone face to face, I usually just have enough energy to hold my phone in my hand and tap out some words to interact with people. And that has been really empowering for me over the last couple of years to be able to feel like I'm still a part of things, like I'm still a part of the world. I'm still able to interact with people I admire and people I like to talk to. I might not be able to like go out and get coffee or drinks with somebody the way I used to, but I'm still able to interact. And that is part of the reason Twitter has become such a major part of my life in the past couple of years. Yeah.
Another thing, I think you talk about the ability to remain connected when you're not able to in other fashions, but also I know something for me is been a very valuable thing is that like Twitter, for all that the internet can be a total cesspool, Twitter in particular has been sort of this wellspring of support as well, and positivity. And I know oftentimes your posts will be that for me, or, another person who often is very generous with positivity is Sarah Gailey. but there are just a lot of people like that who can just be very kind to one another, or to complete strangers, or just to the world. And I don't know, it's not the kind of thing that I think when I was younger, I would have probably laughed that off a lot more. But it's been surprisingly inspiring isn't quite the right word, but something from which I can draw strength at a lot of times when I'm feeling otherwise low.
Yeah. Like there are things that happen on Twitter like that I can't imagine it happening on that I can't imagine happening on other social media platforms, first of all, but also that I can't imagine happening quote unquote IRL. Like yesterday, for example, Nicole Belanger, who I follow, tweeted, "I'm at work and I am not super busy right now. So if you're in need of encouraging DM, like let me know." And I was feeling really anxious and bad at the moment. So I tweeted at her and I said, "Hi, like me." And then she sent me this like paragraph of a DM that was so kind and encouraging and specific to me and her relationship with me. And I took a screenshot of it, and I can't imagine that happening on Facebook, and I can't imagine that happening on Instagram, and I can't imagine that happening in person with somebody. Like, I don't know how that would happen in person with somebody. Another example is Rachel Syme used to do this a lot. She doesn't quite do it as much anymore, but she used to say, "Tweet at me a selfie." And then she would give you like a terrific compliment about your selfie. Like no matter how quote unquote like good or bad your selfie was, she would say something really delightful and wonderful. And I think there are a lot of people that do things like that, and I really like it. It can really be a bright spot in an otherwise dim day. So yeah, that's another thing.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I want to just say, though, I really appreciate you taking the time talking with me. I just, like I said at the beginning, I enjoyed the hell out of your book. And I really do hope that, hopefully if this can get at least a few more people to read it, that'll certainly make me happy. And, also, I'll probably put this in the end of show bumper as well. But like, if anybody wants to talk to me about your book, I would love for other people to tweet at me and have a conversation about it, because I think this is one that I'm going to be thinking about for a long time.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was really nice to be able to talk to you, and I will see you on Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes to where you can purchase both The Border of Paradise and Esme's essay collection, The Collected Schizophrenias. I highly recommend both of them. You can go to esmewang.com/rawness to register for Esme's guided e-course on restorative journaling, the rawness of remembering, and use the coupon code GOODBYE2020 to get over 30% off the registration fee, now through the end of the year. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you've been enjoying the show, please tell a friend. Better yet, tell 2 friends. Better yet, tell 3. If you happen to do that on Twitter and tag the show at ChannelOpenPod, that would be a truly wonderful thing. You can find all the rest of the show's social media information, email, newsletter, show notes, and transcripts at keepthechanneleopen.com. Next week, I'm continuing my hiatus and revisiting my 2017 conversation with poet Jose Olivares. That will be re-airing on December 16th, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.